Welcome back to Joe Stunner Boxing. I hope you're doing well. Looking forward to the weekend. We have Bam and Sonny coming up at the weekend. Should be a good one. Very intriguing fight. But the reason for this video is I just want to ask you a question. I want to ask the sensible people a question. The ones who have a couple of brain cells to rub together. And that question is, why are some boxing fans so unpardonably, unbelievably stupid? Now, you can say this about any sport. I'm sure you get it in football, anything. In life in general, you always get idiots. I mean, there's about, 6 or 7 billion people on the planet? It stands to reason there's going to be a few hundred million morons. But I was reading through a few posts on a boxing Facebook page. And there were a couple of posts that were so unbelievably dim. You have to wonder, is the person trolling? I mean, they may well be trolling, of course. Let's not forget that, They may just be wanting to stir the pudding, take the piss, and so on and so forth. But I'll explain to you what I read. First of all, there was a picture of a still of Rocky Marciano trapping the comeback-in aging Joe Louis on the ropes and battering him. And as you may well know, he ended up punching Lewis through the ropes. And to paraphrase the quotes that were put there by the guy who posted this image, this was proof that fighters of yesteryear had no technique, wouldn't last 5 minutes with modern day fighters, were generally useless, and were just crude sluggers. All of them, apparently. Now, the second post was kind of similar. There was no image, but this clown just made a statement about Sugar Ray Robinson, saying, I've seen Sugar Ray Robinson fight. He was nothing more than a crude slugger. He'd get his head taken off today. His head would be put in the cheap seats. I'm paraphrasing greatly, but that was the general gist of what the guy was saying. Now, I can only sort of surmise that number one, there were two separate people who posted these ridiculous things. Number one, like I say, they must be stupid beyond belief, dim, absolutely moronic. Number two, they might be quite young and therefore don't understand the history of boxing. Are going entirely on the eye test of maybe a few clips. Number three, they may be biased in that they favour their modern day fighters and hate the idea of someone saying that the old timers had it worse or had it tougher or whatever. However, they may be what's the equivalent of we'll call this generationalism, generational phobia. How about that? But whatever the case, it may be a bit of all of them. Whatever the case, it is absolutely amazing how some people who claim to be fans of a sport can arrive at such idiotic conclusions. Now, I'm someone who was brought to the sport. It was really my grandfather who got me interested in it. And I was very, very young. And to start with, I didn't really know what I was looking at. Like all of us, I was too young. The first fight I ever watched was the third Muhammad Ali-Ken Norton fight. And I knew about this guy, Muhammad Ali, because everyone talked about him. But I watched it. I didn't know what I was looking at. I had no idea about technique. It was just two guys hitting each other, or trying to hit each other. And I was probably sitting there going, hit him, hit him. You know what kids are like. But guess what? As time went on, I progressed beyond that mentality. And I grew to understand the sport. And by the time I was 12, 13 maybe, I felt I had a pretty decent knowledge for someone of that age of the history of the sport, what the technique was, the different styles of fighters, how things differed from the past to the present, and you know what I mean. And I would have been turned 13 in 1980, so Leonard Durant and Leonard Hearns later on, a year later, and if you go beyond that, it was Hagler Hearns, and that was my sort of era. The rise of Mike Tyson later on in the 80s. But the point I'm making is that almost without realising, I became more knowledgeable because I had an interest in the sport. Now, a lot of these people I see nowadays, they claim to watch boxing, but they don't seem to be making any progress in terms of understanding the sport. And this is not, an older fan berating younger fans, because there are lots of younger fans who are extremely knowledgeable, extremely insightful. I very often watch, videos from boxing YouTubers who are easily young enough to be my sons, and I frequently think, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Oh, that's a good point. Because they understand the game. Some of them are better at explaining things in some respects than I might be. So I don't want to sound ageist. This video isn't about that. This video is about the dismissal. Well, first of all, it's about the idiocy of some so-called fans, or fanboys perhaps, I don't know, wannabe fans. But it's also, moving on to the subject of different generations, it's about understanding the history of the sport. Because Floyd Mayweather, for example, I'm not picking on Floyd, but he boasts of finishing 50-0. Only 30-something years ago, Julio Cesar Chavez was it 91 wins, no defeats and 1 draw, something along those lines. And of course, he carried on with his career and lost, as will happen when anyone carries on beyond their past. Look at Roy Jones, for Christ's sake, another magnificent fighter. Although he did pop for PEDs, naughty Roy, finger wagging, that puts a black mark against you as far as I'm concerned. It always does. But if you go way, way, way back, to people like Willie Pep, I don't know, Benny Leonard, Sam Langford, who else can we have? I mean, well, you're spoilt for choice. I've just mentioned 3 off the cuff. But if you go into, you will see world champions, established long-term world champions, who had well over 100 fights. So when you say, well, the technique wasn't so good now, no, I understand there is such a thing as evolution. I understand that training techniques, dieting and so on is far better now than it was then. Training methods may be far more advanced, sophisticated. Of course, that's evolution. That's true of anything in life. Things get better because you learn from the past. You are, in effect, as the saying goes, standing on the shoulders of giants, and taking it higher, up, up, up. Better, better, better. That's what we want. That's called progress. But to dismiss, these great fighters from the past, look at Ray Robinson and Jake LaMotta. Robinson was handed his first defeat by LaMotta and floored in the process. They fought a rematch 3 weeks later. Can you imagine that happening nowadays between an elite middleweight and an elite welterweight? Can you imagine that happening nowadays? A rematch 3 weeks later. So I really object to this dismissal of the past. The past are building blocks. They are the foundation of the sport. And everything that we now see has been built on those building blocks in layers. It's kind of like when people make fun of the women's game. The women's game in its current incarnation has been 12 years, going 10 to 15 years roughly. And people say, yeah, there's a dearth of talent. And of course, because they're at the start of the journey. The whole code of women's boxing is at the start of its journey. The women that you see now, Clarissa Shields, certainly Katie Taylor, Serrano, they are pioneers in a sense. And if you go back before them to Jane Couch in Britain, Lucia Reicher, brilliant Dutch fighter, Christy Martin, these are people that paved the way for future generations to sort of stare down their nose at the people who paved the way for them and say, well, they were obviously inferior. That's why when some fighters talk about old timers and say, well, he was great, but he couldn't have lived with me. Well, do you know that you could have lived with him in his era when you were having to fight every week or 3 times a month or whatever the case may be? Do you seriously think that you could have lived like that, you know, getting paid peanuts, you know, to swap brain cells just so that you could buy food, not living the life of Riley with Saudi money or with, I don't know, back in my day, it was all HBO and then you had Showtime slightly lower. That was the sort of holy grail to get to because then you were on the big money. Pay-per-view nowadays. None of this stuff existed back then. But it exists now because of the work and the sacrifice that was put in by previous generations. And again, that's true of anything in life. We should not forget the past. You know, progress exists, or today's status, the status and the methods and the quote-unquote greatness of fighters today exists because of the work put in by previous generations. So really, I guess this video has been about two things. The stupidity of some fans in not recognising what I've just said, and, as I've just said, you know, the generational differences. Leave your thoughts below. Let me know what you think about this. Do you have any opinions? If so, I'd like to read them. And of course, as always, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Please subscribe to the channel if you're new. I always like interacting with the boxing fans, so subscribe, get your notifications, and hit the thumb up button as well, the like button. Or hit the dislike button. Life's about choice. No, hit the like button. All right, thanks a lot, then. I'll catch you later, lads and lasses. Bye for now.